June 2, 1943. Rust, diesel, stale bread. That was the smell of the voyage. In the ship's hold, German prisoners tried to sleep. No chains, only exhaustion. Their boots had marched through Europe's ruins. Now they were cargo, silent, waiting. Some whispered about American cruelty. Others clung to old propaganda. But beneath it all was a silence they couldn't escape. Fear hiding behind pride. The voyage across the Atlantic was no cruise. Salt air stung their throats. The groaning of the hull reminded them with each wave how fragile their situation was. Above deck, guards paced with rifles, their uniforms crisp and alien. Below, the prisoners tried not to imagine torpedoes, for the war at sea still raged. But it was not torpedoes that haunted them most. It was hunger. Their rations, stale bread, thin soup ladled without care, did nothing to quiet stomachs used to years of scarcity. In Germany, ration cards had already become prayers written on paper. Here, in the belly of the ship, those prayers became gnawing pain. When the ship finally made harbor, they expected the smell of ash and gunpowder, a shore bristling with barbed wire and snarling guards. Instead, as the gangplank clattered down, they were hit with something else entirely. The mingled aromas of coffee, roasted meat, and fresh-cut lumber from the docks. To men who had marched through burned villages, that smell was a shock in itself. For the first time since capture, their eyes lifted. America did not look like a land at war. It looked impossibly whole. The journey inland began with trains. Boxcars rolled through plains so vast the men pressed against the slats just to glimpse the horizon. In Germany, a horizon meant shellfire or rubble. Here it was cornfields, endless and golden, dotted with barns painted red, as if from children's drawings. They passed towns where neon lights glowed at night, something many had never seen. They muttered among themselves, how could a country so far from the front be so untouched, so plentiful? And why did the guards not sneer, not strike, not bark orders with cruelty? Their silence was not friendly, but it was strangely patient, as if the Americans had no need to prove themselves. At last the train slowed. A camp waited, a stretch of land fenced, but not festooned with barbed cruelty. Watchtowers present, but oddly unthreatening. Barracks lined in neat rows like some farmers' outbuildings. The prisoners shuffled through gates, expecting a harsh welcome. Instead, a sergeant with a clipboard spoke in curt but fair tones, organizing them into groups. They were issued bedding, soap, and clothing that, though plain, was cleaner and sturdier than what most had worn in months. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, not of fear. Then came the first meal. The line moved into a mess hall where tin trays clattered against metal. At first they assumed it was another cruel joke. Mountains of bread stacked in baskets, steaming pots of stew, thick slices of meat, and pictures of coffee poured without ration card. The men froze, unsure if they were being tested. One guard, sensing hesitation, barked, "Eat," and so they did. The bread was soft, the meat tender. Rail coffee burned their throats, waking memories of pre-war breakfasts long forgotten. Some ate cautiously, eyes darting. Others devoured greedily, their pride cracking under the sheer abundance. A few could not finish, too overwhelmed by the simple act of chewing food that was not gray or arid. Whispers spread quickly through the barracks that night. Was this generosity a trick? Why would America feed its enemies so well? A corporal muttered that perhaps they were being fattened for propaganda photographs to shame Germany with images of prisoners living better than citizens. Another scoffed, claiming it was just American arrogance. Too much food, too little sense. But in the quiet corners, men admitted to one another what they dared not say aloud. The food filled not just their stomachs, but their doubts. Could an enemy truly be this careless with kindness? In one bunkhouse, a young soldier named Carl pulled from his pocket a crust of bread he had saved, soft as a pillow. He stared at it in the dim light and whispered that his sister back home had stood in bread lines for hours, clutching a card worth almost nothing. He pressed the bread to his nose, inhaling deeply as if scent alone could carry across the ocean. Nearby, an older veteran named Weber chewed slowly, his jaw stiff. He muttered that something was wrong. No war could be this generous. Yet even Weber, hardened by campaigns in Africa, could not deny that his stomach for the first time in years was full. The guards observed with quiet detachment. They had been instructed to treat the prisoners under Geneva Convention standards, but even they could not miss the irony. Outside the wire, American civilians also faced rationing, though never so harsh as in Europe. Inside, these men, who had once worn swastikas on their arms, now ate well, slept safely, and watched the prairie wind ripple like an ocean of grass. One guard later confessed he felt strange anger. Why should killers of Americans eat better than families who sent their sons to war? Yet orders were orders, and America, even at war, was determined to prove something. That strength was shown not only in victory, but in restraint. Still suspicion lingered. The prisoners did not yet weep, not yet allow gratitude to break through discipline. They lay on their bunks that first night, listening to crickets instead of artillery, the silence unnerving. Some dreamed of home, others of the front, but all awoke to a new rhythm. The clang of a bell, the shuffle of orderly lines, the smell of kitchens preparing meals as though for farm hands, not captives. It was only the beginning, the faint crack in a wall of belief. They had expected cages. They found barracks. They had braced for starvation. They found stew and coffee. Yet beneath that abundance, unease grew. If this was how America treated its enemies, what other surprises waited? And if bread and coffee could shake them, what would happen when sweetness itself entered their hands, wrapped in foil, melting on their tongues, reminding them of everything they had lost? The second week in camp brought a meal that none of the prisoners could have imagined. It came not with fanfare, but with the quiet clatter of tin trays sliding along a mess line. The men had grown used to bread, meat, and coffee, strange luxuries in themselves. But this day, the cooks ladled something new onto the trays. A pale golden smear pressed between slices of soft bread. It clung stubbornly to the knife, thick and oily, with a scent both nutty and sweet. The guards called it peanut butter. The prisoners exchanged puzzled looks as if someone had served them glue. Carl sniffed cautiously, pressing his nose close. Weber jabbed at it with suspicion, muttering that Americans would eat anything. But when they bit, hesitation turned to astonishment. The paste coated their tongues, clung to their mouths, forced slow chewing. Some grimaced, others chuckled nervously, but most kept eating, confused yet fascinated. To men who had lived on turnips and Zatz coffee, even strangeness was a feast. The real thunderclap came afterward. Near the end of the line, guards handed out small rectangular bars wrapped in foil and brown paper. The men took them cautiously, unwrapping with care. Inside lay chocolate, real chocolate, glossy and dark, with a sharp sweet scent they remembered only dimly from before the war. For a moment they did not move. The Hershey's name stamped into the squares seemed almost holy, as though the bar had been carved from another world. Carl stared at it, fingers trembling. Weber's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the small miracle in his palm. Then someone bit, and the room filled with silence so deep it rang louder than any bomb. The taste was overwhelming, rich, sweet, unashamedly abundant. For men who had not touched chocolate in years, who had watched their children lick crumbs from empty wrappers, it was unbearable. One soldier, thin as a scarecrow, covered his face with his hands. Another laughed, but the laughter cracked, collapsing into sobs. By the time the line was finished, more than a few were weeping, their tears falling into the brown paper wrappers like raindrops on relic. It was not weakness. These were men who had faced artillery, desert heat, the howl of stokokas overhead. They had buried comrades in shallow graves, marched through fire and mud. Yet it was a candy bar that undid them. The sweetness did not just feed their stomachs, fed memory. Each bite pulled them back to a Germany before ration cards, before bombed-out streets, before hunger hollowed their families. They thought of wives who stood in lines that stretched around blocks for scraps of margarine. They thought of children sucking on crusts of bread like bones. In that chocolate was not joy but grief. To taste abundance when your family starved was a cruelty wrapped in kindness. The guards noticed. One young American, hardly older than the prisoners, shifted uncomfortably as he watched tears streak across sunburned German faces. He whispered to another, "They're crying over candy." The other shrugged. Guess they never had it like this. The Americans had grown up with Hershey's as a childhood staple. Cheap and common. For them it was nostalgia, not revelation. They could not know that to these men a single bar was the weight of a broken world. That night in the barracks the wrappers were smoothed flat, folded, and tucked into pockets as if they were letters from home. Carl held his wrapper against his chest before sleep, whispering that his sister had once saved coins for a single chocolate bar on his birthday. Weber, though still gruff, stared at his wrapper in silence, the hard lines of his face softening in the lamplight. Some traded bread for extra chocolate, desperate to taste it again. Others simply held on to their pieces, too moved to eat more. The candy had become a relic, a bridge between the hunger of Germany and the plenty of America. Rumors spread across the camp that the chocolate was propaganda, a trick to weaken resolve. "They want to fatten us," one prisoner sneered. "So the newspapers can photograph smiling Nazis eating Yankee sweets." But the bitterness in his voice failed against the evidence. Stomachs full, wrappers clutched like talismans. The truth was harder to swallow than the chocolate itself. If an enemy could be this generous, what did that say about everything they had believed? If America's strength lay not only in guns but in its kitchens, how could Germany ever hope to win? Statistics tell the story coldly. By 1944, a German civilian's daily ration in cities like Berlin had shrunk to 200 calories or less. Bread stretched with sawdust flour, coffee replaced by roasted barley. Meat nearly vanished. In America, even with rationing, citizens averaged nearly 3,000 calories a day. For prisoners, the army allotted meals equal to those of U.S. soldiers. Meat, vegetables, bread, and yes, chocolate bars. The numbers were stark, but numbers alone could not capture what it meant to taste sweetness after years of famine. Chocolate became a currency of hope. Peanut butter, a symbol of strangeness that still nourished. Even laughter returned when someone, choking on peanut butter's stickiness, tried to talk and could only mumble, sparking jokes in a dozen accents. For a brief moment, war receded. They were not soldiers or captives, only men sharing food too good to be ignored, and yet sweetness carried shadows. Letters from home, censored but heavy with truth, spoke of hunger, of bombings, of children growing thin. Each bite of American food deepened the ache. Some felt guilt sharper than hunger. Carl confessed quietly to Weber that he wished he could mail the chocolate back across the ocean. Let his sister taste it instead. Weber said nothing, but his eyes betrayed agreement. What good was abundance in captivity when your family lived in ruins? Still, the tears told their own story. Compassion had cracked the armor propaganda had built. The men did not admit it, not yet. But the taste of Hershey's lingered longer than slogans. Food had become a weapon, not of war, but of disarming. And once the heart tastes kindness, the mind cannot easily return to hate. The guards, watching from the edges, whispered their own astonishment. One wrote in a diary that he had never seen grown men cry over candy. Another joked that if the war dragged on, the army would bankrupt itself, feeding chocolate to its enemies. Yet beneath the jokes, unease stirred. These were supposed to be dangerous men, ideologues hardened by Hitler's fury. But here they were, wiping eyes with calloused hands, humbled by sweetness. Perhaps war was not only about bullets and bombs. Perhaps it was also about bread and sugar, symbols that reached deeper than ideology. The camp slept uneasily that night. Some dreamed of home, some of feasts they could not explain, some of sisters and mothers holding empty plates. The wrappers rustled in the dark like tiny flags of surrender, not to an enemy army, but to a truth too simple to ignore, that kindness could wound deeper than cruelty. In the morning the men rose to another meal, but nothing could erase the moment when tears had fallen over peanut butter and chocolate. They had tasted America, and it tasted of contradictions, generosity, and guilt, sweetness and sorrow, and they could not shake the question that pressed on every heart. If a nation could afford to give its enemies candy, what else might it be capable of? By autumn, the camp no longer felt like a holding pen for defeated men, but like a strange halfway world where war's fury could not quite reach. The barbed wire remained. The watchtowers stood tall. But inside the perimeter life took on rhythms that seemed almost ordinary. The prisoners rose at dawn, filed to the mess hall, and ate meals that still astonished them. Yet what lingered more than food was the slow unfurling of encounters. Moments that blurred the lines between captor and captive, enemy and neighbor. The first came with work details. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could labor so long as it was not directly war-related. In America's farmlands, that meant harvesting. Columns of German PSWs marched out under the prairie sky, guarded but unchained, and set to work in fields of corn, cotton, and wheat. Farmers, their sons overseas, watched these men bend to tasks once done by neighbors now scattered across battlefield. At first, suspicion hung heavy. But when the crops came in faster, when barns filled with grain, gratitude replaced weariness. Some farmers left jugs of water in the shade. Others slices of pie wrapped in wax paper. One boy of 10 ran up to the fence line and wordlessly handed a gumdrop to a prisoner. Carl took it, smiling awkwardly, the sweetness tiny yet profound. The prisoners, accustomed to suspicion, could not fathom such gestures. Weber, hardened and gruff, muttered that it was all a performance. But when he returned from the fields one evening with his pocket bulging from an apple given by a farmer's wife, he ate it slowly, savoring each bite, unwilling to admit aloud what the gift had stirred. The truth was disarming. The enemy's kindness was not confined to chocolate bars rationed by the army. It seeped in from the community itself, stubborn as grass pushing through concrete. In the barracks, friendships of convenience grew between guards and prisoners. A young American from Iowa, hardly 20, traded his cigarettes for carved wooden figurines the Germans whittle-led in spare hours. Another guard taught phrases of English, good morning, thank you, while the Germans taught back guten Tag, danke. These exchanges were small, almost laughable, but in the monotony of confinement, they became lifelines. Laughter cracked the silence, and though war still raged an ocean away, within the wire the sound was something close to peace. Music carried across those divides, too. Some camps acquired instruments through Red Cross parcels or local donations. A battered piano found its way into one mess hall, and soon German prisoners played Beethoven and Schubert after supper. The notes drifted beyond the fences, and neighbors paused in their chores to listen, surprised that their enemies could summon such beauty. On Christmas Eve, guards entered the hall and stood quietly as prisoners sang, still knacked, their voices fragile yet steady. For the Americans, the song was familiar in English. For the Germans, it was the language of childhood. For a brief night, there were no uniforms, only human beings joined by carols in a drafty barracks. And yet, even as encounters softened suspicion, unease remained. Some American guards bristled at the generosity extended to the men they had been trained to hate. They remembered Pearl Harbor, Normandy, or friends lost in the Ardennes. Watching prisoners eat well, play music, and laugh struck a raw nerve. One sergeant muttered that these men had killed his cousin, and now they were getting pie from farmers. But orders were orders, and America would not abandon the standards it proclaimed to uphold. That tension hung in the air like smoke, unspoken, but sharp. The Germans felt their own ambivalence. Gratitude wrestled with guilt. In letters home, censored but telling, they wrote of clean barracks, good food, and unexpected kindness, careful not to boast, but unable to conceal truth. Some worried their families would hate them for surviving in comfort, while wives and children scraped by on meager rations in bombed-out cities. Karl, scribbling by lantern light, confessed he had tasted chocolate, but dared not describe it in detail. He wrote instead that he was healthy, safe, and ashamed. Weber grew quieter as months passed. He had entered the camp convinced of Germany's inevitable victory, repeating slogans as though they were armor, but each day of abundance, each act of decency, chipped away at certainty. He confessed once in a hushed voice that he no longer knew who the enemy truly was. He dreamed not of glory, but of bread lines in Hamburg, of his wife's thin face. When a guard offered him chewing gum with a grin, Weber almost laughed at the absurdity, chewing it until the flavor faded, and staring at the wad as if it contained some secret about the world's true balance. There were still tensions, still moments when fists clenched and tempers flared. Some prisoners clung fiercely to Nazi loyalty, scoffing at kindness as weakness. They whispered threats in the barracks, urging resistance, even escape. A few tried, running into fields only to be recaptured, but most did not run. Where would they go? Beyond the wire lay a land of abundance, not hostility. And within themselves, a question grew heavier with each passing day. If the enemy could treat them better than their own leaders had, what did that say about the war they had fought? The children in nearby towns became unlikely ambassadors. On Sundays, curious boys and girls pressed against the fences, tossing marbles, gum, or scraps of paper with doodles. The Germans responded with wooden toys, carved birds, or sketches of barns. The exchange of small gifts became ritual. The guards allowed it, shaking their heads but smiling faintly. Karl carved a tiny horse for one boy who shouted thanks before running off. Weber, who once scowled at such exchanges, found himself sketching a farm dog for a girl who giggled at his serious expression. Food remained the constant bridge. At harvest festivals, local women baked pies and sent extras to the camp. The prisoners, stunned, ate slowly, as though tasting not just apples and sugar, but the collapse of every certainty they had carried across the ocean. It was not propaganda, not staged kindness. It was human, raw, and inexplicable, and it terrified them more than barbed wire ever could. One evening, as winter crept in, Karl sat by the fence, watching the sun bleed across the prairie. Weber joined him, silent for a while. Then Weber spoke, his voice low, weighted. "I thought I knew what strength was," he said. "But perhaps strength is not guns or orders. Perhaps it is being able to share food with your enemy and not feel fear." Karl nodded, unable to answer. The air smelled faintly of Woodham smoke, the barracks glowing against the darkening sky. Somewhere, an American radio played swing music, cheerful and brash. The camp was no paradise. It was still prison, still bounded by wire, still heavy with longing for home. But within those bounds, something quietly radical unfolded. Men who had marched under swastikas now held pies in their hands, now traded jokes with guards, now carved toys for children of their enemies. The conflict was no longer about bullets, but about beliefs, and which would endure when the war ended. As Christmas approached again, parcels arrived filled with chocolate, fruit, and even tiny bottles of Coca-Cola. The prisoners gathered, opening them with reverence. Karl's hands shook as he lifted a chocolate bar, memories crashing against the present. Weber, unwrapping a bottle, whispered, "If this is what they give us, what are they giving their own?" Around the men laughed, cried, toasted. But beneath the celebration, a question deepened, dark and undeniable. If kindness could reach this far, what would it do when the war itself finally ended? Snow fell softly over the camp, muting the clang of boots on gravel, turning the barbed wire into delicate strands of frost. It was Christmas Eve, 1944, and though the war raged with fury in Europe, here in the heart of America, a fragile peace hung in the air. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, a drafty space lit by kerosene lamps, the smell of pine from a makeshift tree mingling with steam from pots. On each table lay Red Cross parcels, brown paper packages tied with string, their contents almost unbelievable. Tins of fruit, cigarettes, canned meat, and once again, the unmistakable weight of Hershey's chocolate. The men opened them reverently, as though unwrapping relics. Carl turned the bar in his hands, staring at the familiar stamped letters. His eyes shone with more than hunger. He whispered that his sister back in Hamburg had not seen sugar in months, that children were breaking teeth on turnip bread. Weber sat stiffly, the foil crackling in his fingers, and muttered that this was cruel, this sweetness that could not cross the ocean. Yet when he bit, his jaw trembled, and he looked away so the others would not see his tears. Around the hall, voices rose in carols. Germans sang, still knacked, soft and trembling, and to their surprise, American guards standing near the doors hummed along in English. For a fleeting moment, the room held no enemies, only men sharing songs beneath the glow of lantern light. Chocolate squares melted slowly on tongues, mixing with memory, grief, and the warmth of voices entwined. Tears fell freely now, not from shame, but from recognition that humanity had outlived ideology, if only for a night, yet the sweetness carried a sting. With every bite came guilt. How could they enjoy abundance while their families starved in the ruins of Dresden and Berlin? Letters from home told of bombings, of hunger that hollowed faces, of children clutching thin blankets against the cold. Some prisoners could not finish their chocolate, wrapping it carefully to keep, as a token, a reminder of both kindness and absence. The foil glinted like silver in the lamplight, fragile as the line between survival and despair. Weber spoke later that night, his voice low, carrying across the bunk. All my life, he said, I thought strength was the iron fist, the march of boots, the crack of rifles. But here I see another kind of strength. A nation that feeds its enemies when it could starve them. That is power. No one answered, but many lay awake, staring at the rafters, the truth heavy as snow pressing against the roof. The Americans, too, wrestled with contradictions. Some guards felt anger watching prisoners eat luxuries their own families could barely afford. Others, softened by the sight of men weeping into chocolate, began to wonder if victory meant more than battlefields. One officer confessed in his diary that he had expected hatred to harden him, but instead he pitied the men behind the wire. They are no longer soldiers, he wrote. They are simply human and hungry for more than food. Spring came and with it the war's turning tide. News filtered through. Germany collapsing, cities burning, Hitler's promises unraveling. The prisoners listened, torn between dread and relief. Some still clung to loyalty, but many admitted, at least in whispers, that defeat was inevitable. The real conflict was no longer whether Germany would fall, but what kind of men they themselves would be when it did. The chocolate, the peanut butter, the pies from farmers, these had planted seeds of doubt in the soil of their old convictions. Carl confessed one evening that he no longer dreamed of medals or parades. He dreamed of bringing his sister to a place where bread was soft, where candy was not a miracle. Weber, who had once barked slogans, now sat carving small toys for local children. His hands steady, his silence no longer hostile but thoughtful. The camp had not broken them with punishment. It had disarmed them with humanity. By the time repatriation came, the men filed out of the gates thinner in pride, but heavier in questions. They carried little, some carvings, some letters, and always the memory of sweetness. For years afterward, many would speak of America not as the land of their enemy, but as the land of chocolate and peanut butter, of abundance that had undone them more than bullets. Some even returned, immigrating in the years after the war, chasing the memory of generosity that had haunted them. Statistics later recorded the effect. Of the hundreds of thousands of German PSWs who passed through American camps, a significant number admitted that their beliefs had changed more through daily kindness than through defeat in combat. Historians called it re-education without classrooms. The quiet diplomacy of bread and candy. Where propaganda had failed, a Hershey bar succeeded. And yet the sweetness never lost its sting. Survivors remembered crying into chocolate, not because it was delicious, but because it was unfair, because it was proof that the war had stolen not only lives but dignity, had lied about enemies, had left children starving while fathers ate candy in captivity. That paradox, sharp as foil, remained lodged in their memories long after the war's end. In the decades to come, some of those men would tell their grandchildren stories, not of battles but of chocolate. They would describe the taste as both blessing and wound, the moment they realized the world was larger than the slogans they had been taught. They would confess that tears fell not because they were weak, but because for the first time in years, they remembered what it felt like to be simply human, tasting sweetness without fear. The war ended, the camps emptied, and the fields of America returned to quiet. But the image lingered. German soldiers, their hands rough from labor, holding candy bars like treasures, their eyes wet in the lamplight. In those wrappers lay a lesson history would struggle to articulate, that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the heaviest truths. A rifle can kill. A bomb can terrify. But a square of chocolate can unravel certainties, pierce the armor of ideology, and remind even enemies of the fragility they share. Karl never forgot the night he pressed a chocolate square to his lips and thought of his sister's empty plate. Weber never forgot the apple given by a farmer's wife, the pie shared in silence. They left the camp carrying those moments like scars, invisible yet eternal. For them, America would never be only an enemy. It would forever be the land that made them cry with candy. And so the story does not end with victory parades or treaties signed in distant halls. It ends here in a quiet camp beneath falling snow, where tears mingled with sweetness, where war's fiercest soldiers were undone not by bullets but by kindness. The wrappers still crinkle in memory, fragile as wings. And one truth remains, echoing across years. It was not barbed wire that broke them. It was chocolate,